Over the past few years, the idea of Arte Útil, in other words, useful art, has expanded beyond artistic practice and into cultural institutions. In 2013, for instance, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven launched the Museum of Arte Útil, initiated by artist Tanja Bruguera, who first coined the term. The aim of the project was to transform the museum into a social power plant. In other words, to mobilize collective forms of usership towards tactical social change. And this was done through sustained activity in partnership with the local community. Another example is the MIMA in Middleborough that announced in 2015 its new vision for a Museum 3.0 based on usership theory. This new mission repositioned the museum as a shared and responsive, a reactive network primarily driven by a civic agenda. Aside from these more established institutions, smaller, less traditional art centers throughout the world, like Ormston House in Limerick and LABattoir in Thessaloniki, have also made social engagement a core objective of late. This shift towards greater utility at an institutional level is an important and urgent turn in the art world. Notwithstanding, it's important to realize that utility doesn't have quite the same implications for art as it does for curatorial practice. And this despite claims that there is no longer any ontological difference between contemporary art and curating, or as Boris Groys puts it, that the acts of making art and displaying art have become indistinct. Transferring Arte Útil's pragmatic goals to an institutional context certainly seems like a logical move. The stability and longevity of institutions offer a greater potential for sustainability than more ephemeral and autonomous art projects. But simply relocating goal-oriented social practices from art to curating overlooks the fact that despite their comparable procedures, their similar modes of operation, there are fundamental differences between artistic and curatorial traditions and effects. Art has long been marked and continues to be influenced by modern aesthetic theory. This theory sees art as society's antithesis. It grounds art's critical value in its lack of social function. In the words of Adorno, insofar as a social function can be predicated for artworks, it is their functionlessness. So when useful art calls for more concrete social engagement, it is effectively negating this tradition by realizing a pragmatic action, an action that aims to directly transform reality so as to have a tangibly beneficial effect on the civic sphere. By contrast, curating as an institutional practice, by definition, already performs a social function. It mediates the encounter between the artist, the artwork, the public, and the institution. This social task, according to Jean Davalon, is to provide public access to artworks and to knowledge by creating an interface between the two foreign realms of public and art/knowledge. Now, if I'm pointing out these differences between art and curating, it's not to undermine the recent institutional momentum towards more social involvement. I strongly believe curators and institutions should adapt their practices towards the pursuit of greater public service. For this very reason, it is imperative at this junction to begin to unpack how art and curating's conflicting traditions and effects shape their specific relation to this idea of efficacy. Peter Ely has suggested that expression is an artist's fundamental act, whereas use is a curator's. If we take Ely to his word, then the question becomes, how can we formulate a theory of useful curating in light of its already existing social function? The term useful curating, use plus curating, naturally suggests some additional socially productive dimension in excess of, on top of curating's basic mediating function. What I want to argue instead is that if it is to remain faithful to curatorial practice, then useful curating can't simply be conceived in terms of a supplementary pragmatic action. Curating can't fulfill this new utilitarian remit in the same way as art. Without this tradition of functionlessness, tacking on a second pragmatic role on top of curating's mediating function risks denaturing the already fragmented practice. Instead, my claim is that use should not be thought of as a surplus to mediation, either expanding or redirecting curating's field of action. On the contrary, this new utilitarian dimension should instead narrow curating's scope. Now, to define useful curating as a narrow scope of mediation, it proves necessary to differentiate curatorial intervention from Arte Útil's pragmatic initiative. To do so, I want to turn to the distinction between pragmatic action and epistemic action that was recently formulated in the field of cognitive science. This notion of epistemic action first appears in a seminal paper written in 1994 by David Kirsch and Paul Maglio on the video game Tetris. By analyzing the behavior of players, Kirsch and Maglio found a distinction between two different types of action, pragmatic actions and epistemic actions. Essentially, pragmatic actions change the world in order to achieve a specific goal, like, for instance, putting cement in a hole in a dam. In contrast, epistemic actions change the world in order to aid cognitive processes by exteriorizing part of the mental computational procedure. Okay, this sounds complicated, but it's really very basic. For example, my 5-year-old daughter counts using her fingers. Or instead of trying to remember everything that I need at the supermarket, I'll often write a shopping list. In the game Tetris, Kirsch and Maglio found that it is much quicker to rotate the falling figures, the zoids, using the controllers than trying to do so in your head. All of the examples that I've just given are different from pragmatic actions. They're not designed to fix a concrete problem like repairing a leaky roof. These actions are designed to help one compute, to solve a mental problem. Epistemic actions change the external environment not as a way of achieving a goal. Instead, they do so as a means of uncovering valuable information that is either unavailable, hard to detect or retrieve to access, or difficult to compute. Epistemic actions are geared towards implementing a plan or a reaction. They change the world in order to simplify a problem-solving task. As Kirsch and Maglio point out, the novelty of epistemic actions is that, unlike pragmatic actions, their purpose is not to have an effect on the environment so much as to have an effect on the agent. Now, if we return to this idea of useful curating, the distinction between pragmatic action and epistemic action provides a crucial nuance in praxis in relation to useful art. Useful art distinguishes itself from other forms of relational aesthetics and discursive practices by explicitly defining its scope of action in terms of a tangible achievement. Arte Útil undoubtedly emphasizes participation, usership, and cooperation. These practices claim agency and emancipation. But ultimately, in effect, they are geared towards a decisive pragmatic action. As Tanya Bruguera affirms in Reflections on Arte Útil, the sense of Arte Útil is to imagine, create, develop, and implement something that, produced in artistic practice, offers the people a clearly beneficial result. A bit further, she adds, Arte Útil has to do with understanding that proposals coming from art must give their next step and be applied, must leave the sphere of what is unattainable, of the desired impossibility, to be part of what exists, of the real and functional sphere. In other words, useful art's ultimate objective, the decisive purpose of its action, is to effectively change the world for the better, a pragmatic outcome seen as an end in and of itself. Naturally, this doesn't mean that social practices never involve embodied cognition. Simply, this is not the project's primary objective. As a consequence, the means deployed are largely directed towards a pragmatic result. To be clear, this is absolutely not a criticism. In fact, I think this way of working does useful art credit, which is why I'm using it here as a reference. In contrast, curating's traditional mediating function shares more affinities with epistemic actions than pragmatic actions. According to Kirsch and Maglio, the main purpose of an epistemic action is to decrease complexity and unreliability. They write, "We use the term epistemic action to designate a physical action whose primary function is to improve cognition by 1, reducing the memory involved in mental computation, that is, space complexity, so for instance, the list of contacts in my appropriately named smartphone. 2, reducing the number of steps involved in mental computation, that is, time complexity, so for instance, doing long division using pen and paper. 3, reducing the probability of error of mental computation, that is, unreliability, so to avoid forgetting the milk or the flour at the supermarket." In essence, curating pursues similar objectives in its field of engagement in contextualizing and mediating artworks. It tries to reduce complexity in order to facilitate communication between the artworks and the public. It does so first by providing information about the work, thereby minimizing space complexity. Second, it sets up a framing narrative and installation device designed to narrow interpretive latitude, thus decreasing time complexity. Curatorial practice also attempts to reduce unreliability by safeguarding artworks against extraneous readings. Its mise en contexte is not only aimed at clarifying the works, it is also designed to ensure that viewers decode the works in a relevant manner, to avoid a bodybuilder, to use a crude example, walking into the Sistine Chapel and interpreting Michelangelo's work as an homage to weightlifting. Moreover, there's another sense in which we might say that institutional practices function as epistemic actions. This sense concerns the role of cultural institutions as collective repositories of memory. When, for instance, the Museu Nacional in Rio de Janeiro tragically burned down in September 2018, it was described by locals as a loss of memory. One of the museum's vice director, Luis Duarte, called the blaze an unbearable catastrophe, stating, "It is 200 years of this country's heritage. It is 200 years of memory." Likewise, former Environment Minister Marina Silva qualified the destruction of the museum as a lobotomy of the Brazilian memory. These accounts suggest that cultural institutions as a whole additionally reduce space complexity by exteriorizing the shared burden of collective remembrance and by providing public access for recall when necessary. In this way, traditional curatorial and institutional practices intrinsically share affinities with epistemic actions, both in terms of their objectives, i.e. this reduction in complexity and unreliability, and in a certain sense, their function, so this kind of memory offloading. It is these parallels at the level of intent and purpose that have permitted me to draw a rapprochement between curatorial practice and this type of cognitive action so far. But leaving aside these shared features, conventional modes of exhibition making and institutional practices don't actually conform to strict criteria of epistemic action. Why? Because these approaches typically contextualize and mediate artworks prior to the show's opening in a display that remains fixed and unaffected by public reception. Standard forms of curating are not interactively looped in with viewers as part of a real-time coupling. There's no real feedback. They are predominantly static as opposed to dynamic praxes. In this respect, useful art provides an interesting point of comparison. While these social practices target a specific pragmatic action, the process often isn't predetermined so as to allow for a greater degree of community input. It can be said that these practices often proceed according to what Kirsch and Maglio characterize as a process of interleaving planning and execution. What this basically means is a mode of operation that begins implementation before all the details of the plan have been worked out. This type of interleaving process is an advantageous approach when one wants to engage with a changing environment that presents unforeseen challenges and obstacles. It is reactive in nature and adapts to emerging situations. As Kirsch and Maglio remark, when the consequences of action cannot be confidently predicted, it is wise to update one's plan as soon as new information arrives. Social practices that rely on what Pablo Helguera describes as a collaborative participation scheme basically undertake their initiative in cooperation with participants prior to the artist having worked out every single detail of its realization. This ensures that participants are linked as part of an interactive feedback loop that enables the project to adapt depending on changing circumstances in view of achieving the set pragmatic goal. In a parallel way, if useful curating is to truly function as an efficacious epistemic action, then it requires a greater degree of dynamic public interaction. It needs to have a much more integrated real-time coupling with the audience. But it's important to disambiguate this requirement from the current emphasis on processual curating. In recent years, the promotion of process-based curatorial approaches has essentially been rooted in the belief that open-endedness, experimentation, and indeterminacy offer a cogent moment of politics, which is debatable. It's interesting to note that this predominant view shares certain affinities with Simon Penny's recent use of epistemic action in an art world context. In his 2017 book, Making Sense, Penny claims that art practices involve embodied epistemic speculation that can be directed towards the creation of new possibilities or problem creation. Penny relies on the concept of the ludic to argue that art, like play, can be exploratory, experimental, and generative. He argues for art's epistemic potential to aid in formulating the right questions, instead of instrumentally using art towards reductive analytical tasks like problem solving, in other words, getting the right answers. In contrast to Penny's view, the idea of useful curating that I'm putting forward here necessarily entails an instrumental and definitive brief. Here again, the comparison with Arte Útil provides a valuable model. As mentioned earlier, useful art often proceeds according to an interleaving process, which supports a degree of openness when it comes to participant collaboration. Notwithstanding, it is not indeterminate in its ultimate function, which is to bring about pragmatic change in specific real-world circumstances. In a similar way, epistemic action may leave the choice or judgment involved in the problem-solving task up to the individual, but it is absolutely tailored towards the resolution of a definitive problem. Therefore, if useful curating is to be truly utilitarian, then it cannot be open-ended and experimental, much as it may be interactive. It must necessarily be directed towards a determinate problem. Far from Penny's view, this understanding doesn't reduce curatorial intervention to a menial analytical task. Instead, my claim is that this idea of useful curating has the potential to focus the practice on urgent problem-solving assignments towards the resolution of specific social issues. Curatorial and institutional practices have the potential to fulfill an embodied cognitive function that is socially beneficial beyond mere memory extension. This implies a shift in praxis from assisting aesthetic judgment to aiding a troubleshooting capability of a different order. Ultimately, my proposal is that such an approach can establish an integrated feedback loop with the audience, but not on the basis of an open-ended, experimental, and indeterminate process aimed at democratic rehearsal and emancipation. Instead, it can establish such a dynamic exchange through an epistemic action aimed at aiding and augmenting the user's cognitive functions towards the resolution of a particular social problem. Accordingly, this involves surpassing classical accounts of participation as well as contemplative modes of reception founded upon aesthetic judgment, in view of a new understanding of public engagement and agency. Now, this might potentially be achieved through greater integration of technology into curatorial practice, enabling more accessibility and closed-loop interaction. Or perhaps it might be done on the basis of new conceptions of the socially extended mind. This remains to be explored.